Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Care Challenges and Solutions for a Sustainable Future conference, which starts today live and with pre-recorded events over the next 3 weeks. We kick off this morning with our first keynote speaker, who I will introduce in a moment. My name is Sue Yendall, and I'm the Director of CIRCLE, the Centre for International Research on Care, Labour and Equalities at the University of Sheffield. And it is my pleasure to open this conference today and to welcome Professor Loretta Baldassar, who is one of Australia's top researchers in social science. Loretta is a Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Western Australia, and so she'll be speaking us today from Perth, Australia. She is the Director of the Social Care and Ageing Living Lab, SAGE, at UWA, and an important and prominent researcher globally on issues to do with care and migration. Loretta's work in 2007, when I reviewed her book for Ageing in Society, entitled Families Caring Across Borders. I was struck immediately by its fascinating analysis, its scholarly excellence, and its innovative and meticulous methodology. And these talents are exceptional qualities which Loretta has brought to all her work in the years since then, in which she has published other award-winning and important contributions, which I know many of you will have read. Loretta is regional editor for the journal Global Networks, and she's vice president of the International Sociological Association's Migration Research Committee. She is also a partner and a very good friend of the Sustainable Care Programme, in which her work connects especially with the work within our teams led by Majella Kilkee, one of our colleagues here at the University of Sheffield. Loretta is going to speak to us today on a large and important topic, focusing on a century of Australian migration. She's called her talk Emotional Geographies of Transnational Family Care, from social death to digital kinning and homemaking. And I invite you now to listen to her contribution, to post your comments and questions if you have any, which we can then discuss at the end of her talk. Thank you very much for joining us, Loretta, and over to you for your contribution.
Thank you very much, Sue. And thank you to all the conference organisers for this wonderful opportunity to present and to kick off this important conference. I'd like to begin by saying that CIRCLE and the Sustainable Care Project provide an outstanding academic environment to participate in. And I'd like to thank you and acknowledge you, Sue, for your excellent and generous academic leadership, and also in particular the wonderful collaboration with Professor Majella Kilkee, who, as Sue mentioned, leads the Care In and Out of Place work stream that I'm most involved in. A special thanks also to Dr. Kelly Davidge and Denise Yates for ensuring the preparation ran so smoothly, and to Dan Williamson and Xander Green for the excellent technology support that makes this live virtual event possible. If there's time, I'm going to try to make use of the interactive response feature leading into the discussion, but let's see how I go. The brief I was given in preparing this talk was to provide an overview of the field of transnational migration and family studies, and to discuss developments in the social uses of new technology. But perhaps the first question to address is why an interest in transnational families, migration, and social uses of new technologies should feature in a conference about care. Next slide. While it may not be immediately obvious, any discussion of sustainable care is quintessentially a migration issue. Similarly, a key dimension of analysis of migration and mobility concerns care. Sustainable care is a migration issue because an increasing amount of formal paid care labour, both in our private homes and in our public institutions, is supplied by migrants. This care labour often comprises the poorly paid, onerous and unattractive jobs locals don't want. Some of these migrants end up in these jobs because they can't find anything else. For others, the opportunity to migrate is tightly linked to this employment sector. The resultant global care economy has given rise to a dramatic feminization of labour migration over the past few decades in the form of domestic care workers who take up paid care work in the global north in order to provide financial support to their families back home in the global south. Much has been written about the resultant global care chains and the transnational political economy of care, with major contributions by Professor Joan Tronto, who's delivering the keynote at this conference next week on the 19th of April, titled Ending Wealth Care, the Future of Caring Democracy. Relatedly, but less visibly, an increasing amount of informal unpaid care labour in all migrant families is provided by temporary visiting family members, giving rise to a relatively new category of mobility, the flying grannies, or the flying kin carer. This trend requires us to develop a transnational ethics of informal care, a concept that Majella Kilkey and I have been working on and which Majella is presenting in panel 1B tomorrow. In both these trends, we see how migration is centrally concerned with care, because the motivation for these forms of mobility is to provide paid care or informal care, or both. Next slide, please. So this care mobility, along with all other forms of migration, gives rise to transnational families. How then do we define transnational families? In the simplest sense, these are families whose members are separated by distance. Bryceson and Vorila refer to a sense of familyhood or a feeling of belonging to family despite distance. So then, how do you sustain familyhood across distance? My colleagues Raylene Wilding, Cora Baldock and I build on this definition to argue that the feeling of familyhood across distance is constituted and sustained through practices of care exchange, which we call transnational caregiving. Next slide, please. We argue that all family caregiving, both proximate and distant, is mediated by a dialectic comprising the capacity or the ability and opportunity, the culturally informed sense of obligation, as well as the negotiated family commitments of individual members to provide care within family networks. In transnational families, as opposed to local families, capacity, obligation, and negotiated commitments are impacted by not just local and national socio-political contexts, but transnational ones as well, and potentially multiple national contexts, depending on where all their family members or social support network members live. With Laura Mehrler, we developed the notion of a care circulation framework to capture all of the actors involved in family care, both local and distant, including both formal and informal carers. Next slide, please. This is where the social uses of technology comes in. In order to care for family members across distance, people make use of all kinds of information and communication technologies to exchange support, including emotional, practical, and financial support. A central conceptual and methodological framing of transnational families is therefore the notion of the transnational social field, a social field that transcends physical place that transnational family members share. So this transnational social field is inhabited, constituted, and co-created through family members or transnational support network members' reciprocal, though uneven, care exchanges. These care exchanges play out over the text messages, emails, video calls, social media platforms, all of the digital social connectivity that we have access to today, as well as gifts exchanged through the post and perhaps financial remittances, and also visits made in person. In our previous work, we identified patterns of transnational care. We talked about routine, ritual, and crisis forms of care, as well as different forms of co-presence across distance, virtual, proxy, ambient, and imagined. And I'll be returning to these types of co-presence and types of care as the talk progresses. Next slide, please. So when we discuss sustainable care policy in practice, we also need to discuss migration policy in practice and technology policy in practice as well. Thus, transnational families research draws on the intersections of studies of the family, migration, transnationalism, and technology. And my work delivers a particularly anthropological or sociological approach. Central issues here include what Huang and colleagues call the portability of care, which is impacted by migration regimes, in particular today, restrictions on mobility, visits, and family reunion, as well as the need for transnational policy that transcends national borders, for example, bilateral healthcare agreements, extended care leave, and so on. In addition, we also need policy that facilitates access to reliable technologies, that recognize the importance of the material world, and even considers human, non-human interactions, some of which is determined by nation states, like internet infrastructures and access, funding for technology development, and so on. Next slide, please. In many ways, the experiences of transnational families and caring across distance have become much more familiar to people due to the current pandemic. When I first started presenting this work at interdisciplinary conferences 20 years ago, my main challenge was convincing people that it is possible to exchange care across distance using technologies. This was because the concept of care is so strongly normatively and ontologically understood as requiring physical proximity. In the current context of the pandemic, caring across lockdowns and social distancing has become a much more ubiquitous and shared challenge, even for relatively proximate people. Next slide, please. Many of the ideas in this presentation have grown out of the Australian Research Council funded project, Ageing, Migration and New Media, led with Raylene Wilding and the scholars and PhD students named on this slide. Ageing is a productive frame through which to examine sustainable care and migration because it highlights how the impact of mobility differs across family life stages. For example, another current project on youth mobilities that I'm working on suggests that single middle-class young people report positive experiences of transnational family life due to the increased independence that physical separation from family of origin can bring. In contrast, the mobilities of young people from the global south are more often associated with risk and danger. Similarly, the now substantial literature on transnational parenting of small children indicates that this is likely the most challenging family life stage to sustain across distance. The experiences of transnational aging across distance raises another particular set of issues around aging bodies and minds that might struggle to be mobile and or to use technologies. And these are the key themes in our current research. Next slide, please. Transnational ageing is particularly relevant to Australia as 1 in 3 people over 65 were born overseas. 1 in 3 people over 65 were born overseas. The ageing of our migrant groups reflects the waves of Australia's migration history. This graph shows that our current overseas-born older population is made up mainly of people born in European countries, represented by the light blue shaded bars. But the next waves of older people will increasingly include people born in Asian countries, the green shaded areas. Relatedly, about 40% of the aged care workforce in Australia are recent migrants, and that proportion increases at the lower skills level. What this graph does not capture are the increasing numbers of Australian-born older people who may also belong to transnational families because their adult children and grandchildren have moved away. It also does not capture the growing numbers of visiting older people who are flying in to be with their families based in Australia, the flying grannies I mentioned before. All these types of older people are examined in our research. Next slide, please. What we've learned in our research is that feeling a close connection to transnational support networks or distant support networks can be especially important to older people. As people age, their local support networks may decrease as they become less active. They may begin to rely more on physically distant kin, especially if their main source of support becomes distant kin, and particularly if they begin to lose their fluency in the host language, as many ageing migrants do. They may desire also to reactivate distant kin ties that have fallen dormant, and they may no longer be able to visit distant kin, and so therefore they rely on digital forms of connection. All these factors highlight the importance of digital citizenship for older people, including the need for facilitated access to digital social connections. This raises two often invisible and under-examined dimensions of ageing and care. One, the role of distant or transnational support networks, and two, the role of what Cohen Lewis calls digital care labour, including its untapped potential. And my next part of the talk really drills down into these two issues. So, why is the role of distant support networks undervalued in ageing? Why is digital care labour invisible? And why is it important to consider their potential? Next slide, please. The overarching policy context that informs ageing in most countries of the global north has an emphasis on ageing in place, which, while important, focuses entirely on proximate forms of support and tends to overlook the important role played by distant support network members and of digital technologies in supporting care. Because non-proximate social support networks remained under-acknowledged in the research and policies of ageing in place, we actually know very little about the potential role of non-proximate members of social networks in the support, engagement, and well-being of older people. So rather than presuming distance is a barrier to care and support, transnational family research often considers distance as a factor to be examined alongside other factors that facilitate or inhibit social support and interaction. This approach emphasises the theoretical and methodological importance of problematizing the distinction between local and distant supports and between online and offline worlds, to see them rather as occupying the same social field of interconnected lived experiences. It also leads to an important disruption of our ontological understandings of distance and proximity and their role in enhancing or impeding care. As transnational families research has long shown, it is possible to care well across distance, while proximity does not necessarily deliver the best form of care. Next slide, please. A central question then in transnational family studies is if and how new technologies are transforming relationships and in the process transforming relations of care and support by impacting on who is called upon to care and what and how that care is provided, with implications for sustainability and equity. Next slide, please. A central theoretical question in our current work on transnational ageing is whether the normative assumption that care requires proximity has limited our understanding of the role of distant social networks and impacted on policy, particularly for the elderly. We are also closely considering the materialism involved, that is, the impact of the medium on the means. In other words, does new media transform care or just facilitate it? As already noted, this has led us to an interest in digital citizenship and the digital divide, access to the internet and the ability to use it, particularly for older people. Here, the role of ageism and the way older people are understood in relation to new technology is particularly relevant. Who here is not guilty of giving their hand-me-down technology to older members of their kinship networks, as if they don't really need good quality technology? So, for example, there is no policy governing access to the internet for residents in aged care facilities. Many aged care facilities are black spots with no internet connectivity. No policy governing digital care labour and digital social care. By that I mean the training of care workers in the use of digital technologies. However, interestingly, COVID is helping to change this. It's through exploring these questions in the context of transnational ageing that Raylene Wilding and I are developing the notions of digital kinning and digital homing, which is still very much in development and which I will be discussing in the next part of the presentation and really welcome your thoughts on. I'm interested to see if you find them convincing. Next slide. So first, a very, very brief note on methods, and we can return to this in the discussion. Our project comprises Australian samples from each of the country of birth places listed here. We conducted ethnographic interviews, participant observation, network mapping, as well as, unexpectedly, applied projects, including delivering digital literacy programs, as exemplified in the photograph in this and the previous slide. This one taken at a Chinese day centre and the previous one at a Southern European residential care facility. Next slide. So let me now share some case studies. First, the case of Rena, a transnational ageing example. Rena lived in Italy and together with her husband had enjoyed visiting her daughter Daniela in Australia regularly. However, when her husband died unexpectedly, Rena's social support network diminished rapidly as he was the social one who maintained these ties. Rena became depressed and her daughter Daniela decided to arrange for her to take an extended 3-month visit to Australia. At the time, 3 months was the visit limit. The visit went well and Rena's mental health improved. However, towards the end of her visit, Rena fell and broke her hip and was hospitalised. Reciprocal healthcare benefits helped considerably. Italy and Australia have these reciprocal benefits. However, in hospital, Rena became gravely ill with hospital-acquired pneumonia. Unfortunately, when her visa expired, despite applications to the minister, Daniela had to take time off work to accompany Rena back to Italy in a critically ill state, which, by the way, the airline had no problem with. Daniela considered the 2 pathways for parent migration to Australia open to Rena, but both turned out to be impossible. At a cost of over 50,000 Australian dollars, the contributory visa stream was not affordable. While the non-contributory visa stream is more affordable, it has a 30-year wait period, which made this unrealistic. Australia has since introduced new extended visit visas, but these require older people to return to their home country periodically and are not without health insurance and sponsorship costs. But at the time, these were not available. Back in Italy, Daniela was unable to secure a place for Rena in a local nursing home because the director argued that family care or informal care was an essential component of residential care, and with Daniela living in Australia, this was not going to be adequate. Daniela tried to make the case that she would put in place the necessary paid carers and coordinate this from Australia, but the nursing home remained unconvinced. Clearly, the director did not factor in the potential role of transnational support networks and was unprepared to train her staff in digital care labour to facilitate that digital connectivity. So instead, Daniela had no option but to hire 2 migrant care workers and organise around-the-clock care for Rena in her own home. Daniela Skyped the care workers daily at their shift change for updates and to give directions on her mother's care. And she also made regular visits whenever she could get time off work, but that's quite expensive, right, from Australia. This went on for 2 years until her mother's death. So this is an example of transnational care by proxy, from which the notion of digital kinning first emerged. Daniela delivered care to her mother through the daily orchestration of care tasks of the care workers, so by proxy. And Rena grew not only dependent, but very fond of the care workers. Several care workers were hired and fired until the right fit was found. Rena said the care workers were like having her daughter there. Daniela and Rena maintained a close relationship through a daily routine of Skype calls, text messages, and emails that were facilitated by the care workers. Together, they engaged in digital care labour. In other case studies in the research, this care labour is provided by other kin, including kin who may not previously have been active in the support network, but who are called upon to take up this role. And in some cases, it's a mix of kin and paid care labour. Next slide, please. So, how are we defining digital kinning? We conceptualise digital kinning as a process that facilitates and expands the support networks of older people, particularly those networks that that are at risk of diminishing due to the impact of migration and mobility. We think the concept of digital kinning is heuristically useful to think with in two ways. Firstly, it highlights how the practices and processes of transnational caregiving utilize digital care labour. And secondly, it also highlights the ways these digital practices activate and fulfil obligations and responsibilities associated with kin roles, including among non-biological and geographically distant support network members, which are particularly important to migrants and older people, and older migrants in particular. Because as they become more vulnerable and more dependent, they require more care and support and have to activate carers and care support. Next slide, please. So why the term kinning? This term comes from the anthropology of adoption, where it is used to describe the process of becoming relatives. Sidney Howell's concept of kinning was first used to describe the process by which a newborn child, or a previously unconnected person, and in the context of our research, we would add a disconnected person, is brought into a significant relationship with a group of people that is expressed in a kin idiom. In Howell's view, kinship is something that is necessarily achieved in and through relationships with others. The main argument here is that kinship ties, both biological and non-biological, do not exist a priori, but are negotiated on a daily basis through diverse activities, with care being a significant example. Similarly, Marshall Sahlins, anthropologist of kinship, argues that kinship is an entirely cultural construction, even when it is biological, because the social bonds of kinship are culturally constructed. For Sahlins, kinship is a form of mutuality of being. Kinfolk are persons who participate intrinsically in each other's existence. They are members of one another. And I really like that social relational definition of kinship, because that's really an issue that's emerged in our research. Adela Suralova was the first to apply Howell's concept of kinning to the context of transnational families in her study of the daily negotiations of becoming a member of a family for elderly Czech nannies who care for second-generation migrant Vietnamese children living in the Czech Republic. So she didn't talk about it in terms of digital kinning, but in terms of the kinning of Czech nannies, paid nannies in that transnational family context. Our argument is that kinship ties may be lost or wither away without facilitated connectivity and negotiation, and they are particularly at risk for older adults whose social networks often become smaller as they get older, in particular for older people if members of their social networks are living at a distance. As a result, older adults are particularly in need of creating new care support networks, and this seems to be achieved through processes of kinning. This is what we documented. These ideas about kinning align with the emphasis in family studies on performative definitions of family as what is done. For example, Morgan's sociological accounts of family practices, which are well known. We employ the concept of kinning rather than family practices because kinning helps to illuminate the engagement of older migrants in performing and expressing the affective ties, the emotional geographies of mutual support and care through strong, enduring social relationships that develop a mutuality of being or lived experiences of relatedness. And I'll come back to this point later. Next slide, please. So why digital kinning? So we twin the term digital with the notion kinning. Firstly, these practices of distant care feature, obviously, the use of new technologies that are embedded in social relationships of reciprocity. Thus, digital kinning comprises the inherently relational practices and processes of caring across distance through the uses of new technologies, which constitute, build, and maintain kinship relations. And this is a really important point because for older people in particular, these digital kinning practices often require facilitation by others, that is, help using the digital devices, as in the case of Rena. And this further emphasizes their social relational nature and the way they're embedded in this social relational dimension. Kinning practices enable those who are geographically distant to use the connected presence facilitated by communication technologies to participate intrinsically in each other's existence, thereby developing a mutuality of being and safeguarding their socially and culturally relational selves. So digital kinning is the process of negotiating and maintaining this mutuality of being, including across distance. And I have some other examples next to try and show that more clearly. Secondly, the concept of kinning, as we've said, highlights the processes of becoming kin, not on the basis of biological ties, but on the basis of what is done, performed, and exchanged. Importantly, the kinship idiom is a feature of relationships of care in the aged care sector. In fact, there's a literature about how older adults regularly use the kinship idiom as a way to manage relationships with paid carers, particularly migrants from collectivist cultures. For example, people often say of their main carers, she's more like a daughter to me, or she's like a son. So that kin idiom. Next slide, please. Of course, the use of the term kinning to refer to paid care workers is no doubt controversial because it raises an important set of questions about power and the potential for abuse within families, including how care obligations are often disproportionately borne by women and how they may be exploitative. Also relevant, of course, are the broader issues around domestic care worker abuses and modern slavery. However, we think the tensions around affect and obligation and the mix of both positive and negative emotions so commonly involved in the emotionally taxing work of caregiving are, in fact, inherent to kinship relations and evident in the process of becoming kin. So arguably, this makes the kinship idiom even more relevant and perhaps explains why the kinship idiom is so common in these settings, even to refer to paid carers. Our notion of digital kinning was developed as grounded theory out of our analysis of the digital practices that foster the mutuality of being that defines kinship in the case studies of our research. Next slide, please. What became clear to me in working with older people is that as they become less independent and more vulnerable and more in need of care support, it was clear that they had a desire for an ideal type of kinship or family care. Most wanted to be supported in their aging by family and friends, as well as by paid carers in that way. Carers who are sensitive to the social relational dimensions of identity and belonging, particularly important to dignity in the very difficult and taxing care tasks that are required of carers as people become very vulnerable. This is why I like Salen's notion of a mutuality of being, because it emphasizes the social relational dimension, which our case studies suggest is at the heart of what older people, and perhaps all of us, but especially care-dependent older people, yearn for. The notion of a mutuality of being reminds me of the beautiful work by Lars Christer Heiden on narrative collaboration and scaffolding in dementia studies. This links to the theory that we co-narrate our own and each other's lives, and this practice is clearly evident in the way carers narrate the social lives and social identities of their care dependents, particularly those with limited capacity to narrate their own social selves into being. So you see this really clearly in people living with dementia, who often rely on their carers to co-narrate their social selves. And this discussion raises several questions. Could highlighting care that strives for a mutuality of being safeguard dignity, even when it is a mix of both positive and negative emotions? It also raises a question central to transnational family studies. Can we care across distance? Can we share a mutuality of being across distance? Can we co-narrate each other's lives across distance? So let's look at these questions in the next case studies. Next slide, please. This is case 2 from the China-born sample. These cases were collected by Dr. Katrina Stevens. While Rita travelled to Australia to receive care and support from her migrant children, many grandparents travelled to Australia to provide informal care. Due to the high cost of formal care in Australia, Most people in Australia rely on informal unpaid care provided by family members, in particular grandparents. So we don't have a lot of domestic care workers in the home in Australia because of our labour costs. This practice poses a particular challenge for migrants, especially those with young children and with all of their extended kin living overseas, resulting in the flying grannies. So in this case, in order to support their son, Meng and Li Wei take turns with their daughter-in-law's parents, who also live in China, to spend extended visits of 1 year in Australia under the new visiting visa pathways. So Meng and Li Wei come for a year, then they go back to China, and then the daughter-in-law's parents come for the next year, and they take it in turns. While the benefits of strong ties with their children and grandchildren are substantial, the biggest challenge reported by Meng and Li Wei is the disruption to their own lives that the extended visits create, including the time and money costs, as well as the impact on their own social and care support networks. As a result, Meng and Li Wei rely on regular exchanges with their friends and family back home via social media and phone apps, in particular the Chinese social media platform WeChat, to sustain their ongoing care and support network obligations in China. They also report being quite isolated socially in their children's home in suburban Australia, with limited English and no local friends. This has increased for them the importance of digital media for cultural content, including Chinese news, film, and music, which they watch regularly and daily. We refer to this use of digital content as a form of digital homing. This includes the passive consumption of homeland media accessed through the internet for pleasure and to satisfy and sustain cultural identity. Another flying grandmother reported that the majority of her time online, up to 90% of her, by her own estimation, is spent watching funny videos and clips from old films or listening to music, particularly famous Chinese folk songs. Remember, these are older people who don't have established networks in Australia, and their primary networks are back in China. So together, digital kinning and digital homing practices help maintain social connections across borders, as well as safeguard social and cultural identities through the consumption of homeland media. Digital homing is particularly important to the maintenance of social and cultural identities and dignity of self, which are all often at risk in the ageing process, especially in unfamiliar cultural contexts, like those experienced by visiting grandparents, as well as in the context of institutional care, as the next cases demonstrate. Page down. Next slide, please. So, case 1 was an example of transnational ageing, Rita's case. Case 2, are flying grannies. But what of those migrants who grow old in Australia? How are their care experiences different and or similar to Rita and Meng's? For example, Pina. Pina is an Italian migrant in her late 80s. She's very independent, living at home in a granny flat nearby her local daughter and granddaughter's home. While she sees the local people in her network more frequently, she says it is the distant supports who are more important to her. This may be because her proximate daughter nags her about taking her medication and seeing the doctors regularly. Her distant supports include her brother, who lives in Queensland, and her 2 nephews, one in New Zealand and one in Italy, whom she's very close to since their parents died when they were young, and she is their adopted mother. These transnational care practices are essential to Pina's primary support network, particularly as she ages, because she can no longer visit them. She can't visit her brother or her nephews. She only has a monthly email or Skype contact with these men, and Pina explains that because they're all men, she has to be the one who initiates contact, and sometimes she has to insist on that contact until they respond. In fact, because she can no longer visit, her distant care relationships are constituted by the emails and phone and Skype calls. Pina stated that her relationship with her nephews is defined by the new media. She also stated quite categorically that frequency and proximity are not a measure of care or closeness, but rather sharing of who you really are and what matters, which echoes the mutuality of being definition we've been working with. Next slide. So finally, 3 cases in residential care. Lena has been living in residential care for several years. While she needs help to use technology, she is extremely highly motivated to stay in touch with family who live at a distance, who, she explains, help fill her world with meaning despite living inside 4 walls. So she feels very trapped in the care home. In fact, statistics show that migrants are much higher users of the internet than non-migrants. Lena's daily routine commonly includes making phone calls to local and distant members of her support network and checking Facebook posts. She needs help to use Facebook and waits for her children or grandchildren to visit to help her post messages and photos. Lena phones or is phoned by each of her daughters every day, and she is active on Facebook, where she views the posts of all her grandchildren. She also phones her cousins in Argentina weekly, with whom she shares a close relationship, and keeps up with their activities on Facebook as well by reading and liking their posts. All she can really do is like posts. She can't really post content. This reminds me of a joke we heard during our data collection, which is, what is the definition of a nanosecond? A nanosecond is the time it takes Nana to like a grandchild's post. So Lena also loves to Skype or FaceTime her family all over the world, but can only do this on special ritual occasions like Christmas, when she is at the home of her daughter. Without this digital connectivity, Lena says her life would be empty. Can you click enter for the next slide? It's actually, hopefully a phone bill should come up. There we go. I don't know how well you can see that, but if you can see it, you'll see that there's phone calls regularly to Argentina, to Italy, to Margaret River, which is 3 hours south of Perth, car drive. So she is very active, and she's holding up, I have permission to use her photograph, and she's holding up it's actually a cordless phone, which is the closest she has to a mobile phone. Our data indicate clearly that access to digital connectivity and facilitated digital kinning and digital homing could significantly improve the social support and cultural and social identities and dignity of older adults in residential care. But currently, there is no policy governing digital access in care homes, and provision is patchy, with many homes existing in black spots. Although, as I said earlier, this is changing because of COVID. Next slide, please. This is just a graph to show you that migrants, including migrant elderly, have higher rates of internet use than non-migrants. This is pre-COVID, so I don't know how that's changed, but probably it has changed given the earlier slide showing increase in media platforms and apps due to COVID. Next slide, please. So the lack of policy awareness around the potential role of distance support networks and digital care labour to the well-being of older people is a clear issue in the case of Dorothy, who has no access to communication technologies to support her ageing in residential care. Again, this is pre-COVID. Dorothy is an older Australian-born woman who moved into residential care and as a result lost the use of her landline. There's no landline in her room. In fact, this is common now in aged care. There's no landlines because people are assumed to have mobile phones. But older people lose the facility to use older phones, and certain generations don't have them at all. As a result, Dorothy's weekly calls to her son in the UK ended, as did the significant emotional support he provided her. While she has regular visits from her local daughters, she misses the weekly call to a UK-based son, who she said always made her laugh. The residential facility does not provide landlines, expecting people to have mobile phones. Dorothy could not use a mobile phone, and while the care home was prepared to bring a cord-free phone to Dorothy when the son called, the process was cumbersome and difficult. There was no provision for digital care labour to be provided by staff. So Dorothy's case is an example of the scope for policy interventions and applications for new media and social support networks in service delivery. And we see this very clearly in residential care isolation during COVID, the need for digital connectivity. Facilitated calls to Dorothy's son could be built into her care plan and provided by the residential facility if it becomes policy. Providing access to digital connectivity for family and social support as well as cultural content, music, film, news, can significantly improve the dignity of life of older adults who are otherwise lonely and cut off from social supports, as the next case shows. Next slide. So this is my last case study. Stella experienced a rapid decline in language capacity over the course of a few months, losing her ability to speak English sufficiently well to converse with care staff or make her needs understood. Her limited ability to communicate made it appear that her mental capacity had also declined, although she did not seem to have any trouble communicating with her son when he visited, and she had lively and animated conversations with him. As is common, Stella had reverted to her first language, a dialect that none of the staff or other residents understood. Stella had frequent episodes of anguish when nobody could understand what was wrong, which was also very distressing for the care staff and residents, and it's documented that non-English speaking older people can have higher rates of chemical restraint use, and there's a big question mark over whether their behaviour requires that or whether they just lack the ability to communicate their needs. Stella's son could only visit once a week and was reluctant to take phone calls from staff trying to assist his mother while he was at work because he had a very busy job. The staff found Stella increasingly difficult to manage without any means of understanding her. Through the help of a multicultural service provider activated through our research project, a volunteer was located who could speak Stella's dialect, but the volunteer was herself in her 70s and unable to drive. The volunteer had been trained to make social visits with older adults in her neighbourhood to provide companionship. Her neighbourhood was an hour away, requiring 2 bus journeys by public transport. So a system was established where staff could book a phone call with the volunteer as part of Stella's care plan. This enabled Stella to enjoy contact with someone she could communicate with beside her son's weekly visit. Staff reported that Stella began to look forward to these calls as much as her son's visits. During the call, staff also enjoyed hearing about Stella's conversation as reported by the volunteer. This would enable staff to participate more in Stella's social life, to share a lived experience, which was very important to Stella, and she enjoyed hearing the volunteer converse with staff in English. It seemed to make Stella feel a greater sense of belonging, security, and safety. Soon, Stella was able to enjoy talking to the volunteer as well as seeing her on video calls using a tablet purchased by the home. Stella began to walk around with the tablet to introduce staff and other residents to the volunteer on the call. Because it was part of her ascribed role, the volunteer was happy to talk for an hour on the call and seemed to enjoy the experience as well, reporting a sense of satisfaction that she could help Stella feel more settled and help the staff be more assured about Stella's well-being. Stella's case shows the potential of digital care labour as a skill or expertise that care staff might be trained to provide in their role as carers. Next slide. So, what these case studies show is the importance of digital kinning and digital homing and distant care support networks in experiences of ageing well by providing a source of social connection and support, by supporting the maintenance of cultural identity, particularly for those who can't speak English or lose the facility in English, as well as protection of social identity, as we saw in the case of Stella. Next slide, please. So the notion of digital kinning is an attempt to capture the process of becoming kin through an emphasis on the social relational dimensions of care, defined by mutuality of being, both in transnational settings and also in settings characterised by reduced social network support, as in residential care contexts. A related conceptual question then is whether defining care in terms of kinning is a useful way of refining what we mean by care in these contexts. This responds to a common critique of the notion of transnational care as being too broad. So rather than arguing that every transnational communication is a type of care, which we've been critiqued for, saying it's too broad, we ask instead, is it more appropriate to define transnational family communication exchanges in terms of kinning processes? Relatedly, is it helpful to define care in social relational terms as a mutuality of being? And this relates to Majella Kilkey and my discussion of the need for a transnational ethics of family care. I'd like to end this section of the presentation by reflecting on the potential role of the digital kinning of support networks, distance support networks, and the potential role of digital care labour to improve the well-being of older people at risk of social isolation. Next slide. We've just had a Royal Commission into aged care in Australia over the past couple of years, which has released some very sobering reports. The interim report was grimly titled Neglect, and it stated that aged care systems in Australia fail to meet the needs of its older vulnerable citizens. It does not deliver uniformly safe and quality care, is unkind and uncaring towards older people, and in too many instances it neglects them. Rather, it is a sad and shocking system that diminishes Australia as a nation. One of the key problems identified by the interim report is that the aged care service sector is based on a transactional notion of care, about payment. Funding is available for medical and personal care. However, despite being essential to well-being, social forms of care are not funded. Social relational dimensions and understanding of care are undervalued. And any sort of social care is left to volunteers or expected to be delivered by the family or expected to happen magically. The final report, which was only just handed down, addresses this issue, stating that the current system does not sufficiently recognise the importance of proactively supporting older people's social and emotional well-being. It highlights the shocking levels of isolation and loneliness in the sector, calling for a social supports category within the aged care program that provides supports that reduce and prevent social isolation and loneliness among older people. It also points out that the aged care system is well behind other sectors in the use and application of technologies and has no clear information and communications technology strategy. So we think our work on digital kinning and digital homing can be an important contribution to responding to the findings of the Royal Commission. Next slide. So coming out of the ARC project, we established a new research entity, the Social Care and Ageing SAGE Living Lab, which focuses on applied projects and some of those digital literacy projects that were evident in the presentation. So I think I could conclude here. I'm not sure how we're going with questions in the chat. So we could even use the poll now to take a poll about whether I should continue or whether we should hand over to Sue to do some discussion. I see.
So much, Loretta. That's been a really fascinating account, and illustrates my opening comments about the meticulous and innovative methodologies that you use. And I'm sure there will be some questions about the methods that you've used and how you've gone about negotiating those and collecting the very rich data on which you've drawn in the case studies. I'm wanting to encourage people to make a comment or ask a question, or to perhaps just add an additional point which they think is within the broad field that we're discussing. But could I ask you, you've raised a couple of issues which really interest me about policy, and I wondered if perhaps we could start with a bit of a conversation about that and the particular Australian policy context. You made the point at the beginning, Loretta, that 1 in 3 Australians are aged 65 and older are foreign born, and that you also have many ageing Australians who have, additional to that, who have relatives living overseas. So it's a particularly important case, perhaps also added to its distance from many other parts of the world, and that huge separation, which I feel very acutely myself at the moment, having a son living in Australia during the pandemic. So I'm very aware of that and of the importance of his contacts with my with his grandfather. So, these are very real and important issues. I'm sure to many of us listening will have these experiences too, and know that, and as well as knowing it from our research. Could you say a little bit about how, before we pick up the questions about care and the very important review that you closed with, but just to go back to your earlier comments about immigration policy, because you mentioned in a number of your cases that there were restrictions or changes to rules about immigration. There were costs and opportunities to adapt, perhaps, but also barriers that come into play that were clearly very difficult for some of the people that you've studied. How is that debate emerging in Australia? What is the support for it in a highly diverse society with many people with experience of migration? How is that changing? And obviously, immigration policy has been a vital factor in the Australian economy as well as in Australian society for many decades. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about where you think that's going, and what concerns and hopes you have for migration policy in Australia.
I really appreciate that question, actually, Sue, because it highlights the relevance of migration policy to sustainable care. And I don't know that that's always very visible, and particularly the role of informal carers, right? So these are the flying grannies. And we had some really high-profile cases during the pandemic where grandparents visiting Australia, young, old people, were actually required by the Department of Home Affairs to leave the country to renew their visas, which turned out to be an error, would you believe? And, thousands of dollars later and risking COVID infection, some of these people actually, tried to leave in order to renew their visas. So this is becoming a critical issue. It's growing in awareness because, as I said, people can't afford paid carers for childcare. We rely on grandparents and informal kin. And if you're a migrant, you need to fly them in. And so the Chinese case is a really great one because, couples taking it in turns to come over. And, you think about the social reproduction dimension here, we need dual income workers, both men and women in the workforce, and yet we also require them to bring their grandparents in to help them make ends meet. So the government really needs to take issue with this because our economy depends on it, and our ability to attract winners, the best migrants that we want in our very highly specified migration program, is going to be impacted by this. And the government has realised this, which is why they've provided these increasing types of visas, which didn't exist before. They still haven't made it possible very easy to have parent migration, though. So the contributory stream is 50,000 Australian dollars. Most people can't afford that. And the non-contributory stream is defined by administrative slowdown. So 30-year wait list means that people don't use it. So it's a very topical issue. It has largely been invisible. It's prey to the idea that older people are a cost burden rather than recognising the considerable contribution they make to informal care. So yeah, that's the debate. And Majella Kilkey's presentation tomorrow, actually looking at the transnational ethics of family care, really targets that issue.
Thanks, Loretta. And I'm sure we're all watching with great interest the way Australian immigration rules change and adapt as different factors in the demography and the mix of origin countries which are represented, particularly in Australia's major cities, I know is changing quite rapidly and is quite an important one. This is something which, of course, might be held up by COVID in ways that, in contrast to the ways in which the increased use of digital media, I think, has been facilitated by it. I want to turn now to a point that's been raised by Magella. Magella has, thanks you for your fascinating talk, Loretta, and she asks about the gendered nature of the relationship with technology. Quite a few of the examples you gave were of women, some engaging, of older women, some engaging with their sons and nephews and other men in their families. But can you say a little bit about how your research has uncovered the gendered dimensions of this, both in terms of the paid work of care, the unpaid caring that goes on amongst relatives who are male and female, and also how it's affected by the gender of the person who needs care?
Yes, thank you for the question, Magella. It is very gendered, and as is the digital uses of technology. So what we found in our research is that, ironically, transnational family networks can expand care supports, because in the past, care was delivered primarily by people who are proximate, but with the polymedia revolution and access to digital connectivity, more distant carers can be involved. And so you have this expansion of the network potentially. And this expansion includes both men and women, which is also different from the past. So in the past, it was mainly women who were writing the letters and exchanging information. But now, because so much technology is involved and men are more likely to be the custodians of the technology, they're involved in setting it up, in purchasing the technology, and then they therefore tend to be in the background, setting up the connectivity, and so they become involved. And a classic example is, grandma needs her grandson to set up the technology for a call in the homeland, and the adult daughter needs her son to help set up her call. And those two cousins, who normally would not have been in touch in pre-polymedia scenarios, they're texting each other to scaffold the Skype call being set up. When is it going to happen? How's it going to happen? Are you ready? And they develop their own relationship, which might not have developed in the past, and they become incorporated into the care network in ways that they wouldn't have been in pre-polymedia times. Then we have also cultural constructions of the obligation to care, and these are often gendered. Sometimes they play out according to birth order, so men might be more required to provide care if they're the firstborn son, but then it ends up being their wives, the daughter-in-law, who provides much of the care work. We have some lovely data actually from some of our PhD students on the visiting grannies and what exactly role they take. So granddad is usually relegated to playing with the children and taking them on works, while grandma is doing more of the cooking and the cleaning type chores. So yes, it is gendered, but there's also this expansion of the network in contrast to pre-polymedia times. I hope that is a sufficient answer.
Thanks very much, Loretta. We've also got a question from our colleague, Kelly Hall, who's based at the University of Birmingham. And Kelly also found your talk really interesting. And she wants you to say a little bit more about the COVID context. She says COVID is clearly very important in this context, as you touched upon, but if you feel that transnational and digital care relationships are likely to transform in the long term as a consequence of COVID. I wondered if you could address that.
Yes, thank you, Kelly, for that really intriguing question. And it is certainly a question that we're, thinking about. Most of our data was collected pre-COVID, but our digital literacy projects and our applied projects are continuing right now, and they are largely in response to social isolation in residential care and among migrant elderly in the community in response to COVID. So I can say that our work has suddenly become more relevant more broadly, and there's more interest in and understanding of what we're doing. And in fact, the research entity, the Living Lab we set up, really has been able to win various funding and consultancies based on this COVID pandemic situation, not only in terms of isolation and the need for digital citizenship, which has become critical, but also in terms of migrant care workers, actually, because migrant care workers have been identified as the weakest link in Australia, or a weak link in Australia in the pandemic response, in the sense that they often live in multi-generational households. Because the care work is so poorly paid, they're often doing multiple jobs in different facilities. So they are an increased risk to transmission. Of course, we have to be very careful here that we don't stereotype the migrant care worker as the risk. That's not it. It's the structural factors around migrant care labour which places them at increased risk in terms of multiple jobs, living in intergenerational households because they don't have much income, and so on. So there's those two dimensions that are very relevant, which have become central to our work. Yeah.
Thank you, Loretta. I want to also give you an opportunity before we ask you to show the rest of your slides, because I've had a sneak preview and I know that they're also very interesting. So I don't want to deprive our audience of hearing you speak about those as well. But could you just say a little bit about the major commission report that you've just spoken about at the end of the first stage of your presentation? I think the story of the unsatisfactory nature of care arrangements is a very familiar one to those of us based in England. We know that some very similar comments could be made about some aspects of care in our country too. This is not in any sense a unique experience in Australia, but the language used in the report does seem to be quite dramatic, and I wondered if that's caused a particular reaction in Australia and whether you see that as connected to the COVID pandemic, as I think we would here. I think we feel that there's been more interest in, more media comment on, more awareness of what happens particularly within residential care, but also in home care arrangements as well. What's the reaction in Australia before you go on to talk about some of the historical developments around migration and care in Australia?
Thank you, Sue. Really insightful question. The interim report was more emotive, and that quote was from the media statement that was released, and that was pre-COVID. And I think it was, we'd begun to hear about the most shocking cases, and so that was sort of the theme and the tune of the interim report. The final report is much less dramatic language and more focused on recommendations, although there's an interesting outcome where the two commissioners have different views on some of the recommendations, and so people are concerned that that's going to waylay the government's response because it's not one set of shared views. I mean, because I was doing fieldwork and ethnographic fieldwork in residential care homes, I can say that some people were just dismayed by the reports, because a lot of people just work so damn hard to do this as well as possible, you know. But there is also real problems as well. And you know, my feeling is advocacy. If you don't have an advocate, you are really at risk in residential care of slipping through the cracks and therefore being neglected. And there have been some shocking examples of this. This is apart from the criminal end of the spectrum, you know, where there's physical and sexual abuse. I mean, that's a proportion of cases which should not be happening and really need to be addressed, but that's not the general, right? So yes, I think COVID we've also, simultaneously with COVID, seen very poor responses and the poor organisation of responses in some residential care, and some shocking outbreaks and results when the government decided to deal with it in residential care rather than moving people to hospital, and that was a big debate. And this has sort of put the spotlight on the care worker, the migrant care worker. So all of these issues have been amplified by COVID, I think.
Okay, I'm going to go back to your presentation and to complete your slides, and then we've got another comment from Magella, which I'll bring in at the end of your remaining slides, Loretta. So back to you now. I'm going to leave.
Thank you. Next slide then. I really wrote the abstract for this report pre-COVID, right? And so I was going to focus on this comparison of pre-polymedia and post-polymedia times to ask the question, can we share a mutuality of being? Can we co-narrate each other's lives across distance across this 150-year history of Australian migration? So I will conclude with that section, but as you can see, I then shifted the talk because of what's been happening, and yeah. So what you have on this slide then is a bit of a summary of co-presence across distance in pre-COVID and post-COVID times, and this comes from one of the most memorable quotes from our research, our earlier research actually on transnational families, the first research we did, where an elderly grandmother, as she referred to herself in Ireland, said, you know, when my uncle migrated to Australia at the end of the 1800s, before he left, we held a wake in the local pub because we didn't know if we'd ever see him again. It was a kind of social death. And then she said, but my grandson, when he migrated recently on a working holiday visa to Australia, we bought a new computer. So from a social death to a new computer is a nice way of capturing the dramatic transformation in the ability to connect across distance that we've seen in the last 150 years. So in the past, co-presence was irregular, asynchronous, intermittent, and formulaic because it relied on primarily letters. And so people used imagined roles that they conjured up in letters, the good father, the good son. And if you subscribe to the view of kinship as defined by mutuality of being, as I've been arguing, it's very difficult to sustain this using the technologies available in pre-polymedia environments. These irregular, asynchronous, intermittent communications often resulted in a diminished ability to co-narrate our own and each other's lives, resulting in broken narratives and therefore arguably diminished forms of mutuality of being, with some exceptions. And I want to show you some examples of the exceptions. But first, let me say that in contrast to the past, this co-presence can now in polymedia environments be synchronous, continuous, multisensory, facilitating the sharing of detailed and everyday narratives that approximate physical co-presence. People say things like, it's like they're really here, or it's like they're always near. And here we have the capacity to share a mutuality of being, a true kinship or co-narration of lives across distance. In fact, some people say they get on better and have more contact with their distant kin when they're not living proximately because they put more effort into it. I've had young people say things like, I actually have to spell out, I love you, Mum, in a text message, and I never would have said that to her if I was there in person. So, you know, our big message is that we can't assume that distance is an impediment to care. We have to treat it as a factor among others. And we can't assume that proximity facilitates the best form of care. We have to analyze it as a factor. So I'm not suggesting that co-presence across distance has become easier even or simpler. Like any type of care work, people have to work very hard at staying in touch, but some people do this remarkably well. So this raises the question of how distance and virtual forms of co-presence are implicitly devalued in relation to physical forms. And I get in trouble for saying this, often implicitly overlooking how some proximate forms of care and co-presence are abusive and damaging. I get in trouble because people say that, you know, the gold standard is to be proximate. So you can hug people and you can dry their tears. And, you know, of course, that's true. But some people don't have that ability. And older people who can no longer visit, you know, just think of the heart strains in those situations. They can't visit their grandchildren. So they have to rely on digital forms of co-presence, and they want to still share a mutuality of being. So can they do that, and how do they do that? So it's not the distance or the virtual forms of co-presence per se that are bad or lesser. It is how they are experienced and practiced. And as I said, I realize this is a deeply contentious argument. So the notions of digital kinning and digital homing are offered as conceptual and theoretical tools to examine these questions and help us think about them. I think I can skip the next slide because I sort of talked about these points in my response to Majella's question earlier. I might just add Maddie and Al's comment about the phatic function. You know, you can just carry your mobile phone around with you and hear it ping or feel it vibrate, and you don't have to read the text. You just know that that's someone thinking about you, or the text message you get every day from your mum checking in on you. You know, so that's a new form of care that's digital, that we need to factor in to our analysis. The phatic function of communication exchange, the emotional reminder of the distant significant other. So the notion of ambient co-presence. So polymedia offers the potential for the first time in history to control when and how we stay in touch across distance. We didn't have this potential in pre-polymedia times. It also introduces a choice. So a moral element is now introduced. So I like to use the example of the question, is it okay to text your mum happy birthday, or do you have to video call, or do you have to visit in person? Because this becomes relevant to proximate family members as well, right? You might be proximate to your mum living locally, but you're still using digital connectivity, right? So do you need to visit because you can, or can you text? Of course, in pre-polymedia environments, there were no options. So you only had the letter and maybe, you know, telegrams. So the moral, affective dimension, the emotional geography and the moral economy, affective economy becomes relevant now. So what I want to do next is just compare some examples of co-presence across distance in pre-polymedia and post-polymedia times. So next slide. And I want to do this by using the 4 waves of Italian migration. There was an Italian migration because my research has primarily been on Italians, and this becomes like a longitudinal study because I have what's called ethnographic returning to these cases over the many years that I've been doing this research. So there's 4 waves of Italian migration to Australia: a small pre-war wave, The largest, most substantial post-war cohort in the 50s and 60s, a smaller 1970s cluster, and then a recent new migration post-2000 of young, mainly working holiday visa holders who are arriving, I was shocked to learn, in numbers greater than in the post-war years, but not many are able to stay. They're temporary. So the bottom two colour photos also are an important point, allow me to make an important point about the heterogeneity of migrant groups. So the post-war cohort, 70% of them are now over 70 years of age. These are the people who grew old in Australia. We have side by side with them these young new arrivals who are in their 20s and 30s. But then, complicating the picture further, is the presence of visiting grandparents, the parents of the recent cohorts, who are the flying grannies, who can only get into Australia on restrictive parent visas. And then we have the second generation of the pre-war cohort. So in the picture to the left of your screen at the bottom, you can see a group of women. 4 are Italy-born post-war migrants who grew old in Australia. 3 are Australian-born second generation of the pre-war cohort. And 1 is a visiting grandparent from Italy. And all of them are in their 70s. And they're cooking up a storm at one of the Italian Regional Club events. So this is a heterogeneous older migrant population with different language abilities and different ideas about aging. And I wanted to make that point too. So if the next slide is proving all my method and many years of ethnographic research, next slide is an example of a pre-war co-presence from Jackie Templeton's beautiful book of letters between Italy and Australia. And some emblematic examples from this work is the cost of a stamp being prohibitive to staying in touch. People couldn't afford the cost of a stamp. The second quote highlights the work of imagination or imagined co-presence. Next slide, please. Here we go. So I'll read this quote. It's written by a father in Australia who I'm calling Dino, who says, "I think of him often and see him in every moment of the day, just as if I were with you, trying to forget how far away I am. And at the end of the day and after my hard work, I can't have before me everything that made me happy, listening to him, seeing him, playing with him. And instead for now, I have to content myself with thinking of him and imagine he's in front of me, happy and mischievous, just how he was, and I escape into my thoughts and I'm happy." This is imagined co-presence, right? And you see this yearning for a mutuality of being in these letters, which I think is palpable in that example. Next slide. So most people, this is the second cohort, an example from the 50s and 60s. Most people from the second cohort also bemoaned the inadequacy of letters, as evident in this example from an interview with Federica. Federica and her family generally maintained regular contact by letter, although there were what Federica describes as dark periods when she did not feel as emotionally supported as she wished. "I felt that, well, I might as well be dead for them because, you know, I'm so far away." So this is a kind of social death she was feeling, right, in the pre-polymedia time. Federica is bemoaning and even chastising the lack of mutuality of being, the absence of kinning. "I felt I might as well be dead." And the sense of isolation was exacerbated by contact being primarily by letter, which gave Federica an unsatisfying level of detail about daily events. "I want to know exactly what's happening. And like during the visit home, I used to find out that this happened, that happened, and I was reproaching my dad for not telling me. Also the negative things, like somebody died." So mutuality of being is both the positive and the negative. You can have a mutuality of being even in, you know, a negative set of emotions. These dark periods diminished as phone calls became more affordable. At first it was really expensive, so you couldn't say much. But then when the price reduced, that was very, very important, I think, because, I mean, you could pick up the phone more or less any time and check how things are going. Something's worrying you, you pick up the phone. Next slide. Even the post-1970s group report worrying about the cost of the call. So you can't focus on the content because you're worrying about the call. Not sharing information to protect loved ones. So that not sharing information is a barrier to mutuality of being and co-presence across distance, even though you're trying to protect people. So in this example, this informant says, you know, a big salary at the time was $13 a week, but it cost $1 a minute to call. So these were real barriers. So as phone calls became more affordable, that really changed things. Next slide. So the contemporary example is a real contrast because now we have polymedia environment. And this is an example from Andrea, who arrived in the last decade. And his case represents a common pattern of staying in touch across distance. Andrea is studying in Australia. His mother, Anna, sends him texts every day, even too often, bemoans Andrea. Click enter, please. She's always sending these stickers on Viber. They're kind of silly, but for her, they are a way to tell me that she is thinking of me and that she is caring about me, ambient co-presence. Andrea feels he has to reciprocate by sending stickers back to his mother, but he has trained her to accept that 1 or 2 a day is enough. Next. Andrea says he has to become religious about the weekend Skype call. You have to have a really good reason to skip the call, you know, like you're dead. So this is a nice contrast of social death and bemoaning it in the post-70s and earlier groups. And here Andrea bemoaning that now there's too much social media and too much surveillance and, you know, you can't escape it. So during the call, his mother and father both participate, but it is usually his mother who stays on the call the longest. Dad will come and take a good look at me, see if I look okay and say hi. Mum will ask me lots of questions, go into detail. What am I eating? How am I sleeping? What am I feeling? You know, she really worries about me and she tries to look after me. So she tries to gain a mutuality of being. She wants to know enough about him to be that close. Of course, I like to see them too, but really once a week is even too much for me. It's an obligation. So again, life stage is important because he's a young adult. His parents are relatively independent. This would be very different if they were old and frail or if he was a small child and a mother wanting to stay in touch, right? So here you see the impact of the polymedia environment. Next slide, please. This is how I wanted to end. This is a new book. I encourage you all to read it. An extraordinary collection of letters published by Sonia Kanchan in her recently published edited collection. An extraordinary collection of letters between Antonietta Petris and her fiancé Loris Palmer in the years 1948 to 1949. And this allows me to use the function that we have available where you can vote or answer a question. So I'm asking you, how many letters did these 2 young people write to each other? They were betrothed in that 1 year between 1948 and 1949. Don't Google the book. I'm not telling you the title, so you don't Google it. How many letters? I want you to vote, and we can have a look at the answer after I read you some examples. So can you press enter, please? Okay, so here are some quotes from the letters. Even today, I clearly see myself writing diligently to Loris during many a late evening. To Loris, I describe everything about me, all my activities and thoughts of a given day. It felt as though I was sitting next to him and I could hear his every breath, yet alas, how far we were from each other in reality. She was in America, Canada, he was in Italy. What made this all possible was our determination, our love, and the letters that kept us in touch despite the enormous distance between us. The flow of letters must be constant, lively, and continuous, because if one day that disappears, it would be over. I reread the letter that you wrote in Venice, an affectionate letter as always. I can honestly say now that distance does not lead to forgetting. Actually, it leads to deepening, as you say, love and affection. Yes, I feel that I love you more and more. On Saturday, I received your last letter written on the 10th of this month, and then nothing. I know I am demanding. You will remind me that it's been only 4 days since I had received word from you, but those 4 days have been eternal for me. I hope to receive a long letter from you tomorrow. The hardships we are facing must be relieved by our writings, and especially by your writings of love. These are crucial to me. They are essential and they give me moral and physical strength. It's 11 at night and silence reigns in every corner of this home. Everyone is sleeping. My eyes won't close. Why is that? It's easy to guess. I think of you. I want to be near you. I write to you. Only when I write to you do I feel you close to me. That was the most romantic quote of all of the letters. So there were no sexting back then. But let's see how we're going with the answers. Is anybody answering? Do we have a poll? Otherwise, I'll just tell you the answer. Tell us how, Sue is saying. Do we know how to? Can I provide some explanation of how to vote? Go to the stage chat. Poll is in the stage chat. Click on poll. Can you all click on poll? Let's see if this works. It could be fun. You can do it too, Loretta. Okay. Lots of people are saying 50 plus letters. Okay, good. Let me tell you the answer. The answer is 450 letters, guys. Woohoo, in 1 year. And if you think about it, how many texts do you send to your loved ones? And how many texts do you send to your romantic loved ones? So that's the sort of same number as texts maybe, or texts maybe in the thousands, I don't know. But anyway, I think, you know, the technologies of co-presence, even in pre-polymedia environments, could be akin to mutuality of being, in that example anyway. So my final slide, I'll leave you with a meme. Next slide, please, of a reworking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that's the end of my talk. Okay. If you can go to my final slide, Xander, that would be great. That's it. So there's the meme of basic human needs with the internet at the bottom. Of course, the World Health Organization, no, the United Nations, some years ago, made a case that access to the internet is a human right. They were arguing for it for access to information, but we could argue that it's a human right in terms of connection to social support networks. I think that we could make a strong case for that in transnational family studies. I think Sue is requesting to join again. I don't need that slide actually, Xander, thanks. It just shows you that older people are increasingly using digital media. So perhaps the digital divide is narrowing, especially due to COVID, I imagine. And perhaps the issue of digital literacy will be less of a problem for future cohorts of older people, but not the requirement for facilitated digital access, because as we get older, we may lose the capacity to use digital media.
Thanks, Loretta. We're just trying to get Sue back into the backstage. We've lost her from our backstage. So I'll just pass on a comment from Magella, if that's okay.
Sure.
It says, following on with the theme of COVID's impact, she thought it was very interesting last week that in an interview, Grant Shapps, who's the UK Secretary of State for Transport, acknowledged the existence of transnational families when arguing that UK residents should be allowed to travel overseas in the summer to visit grandparents. At the same time, though, the UK government, through its migration policies, restricts transnational family life. Yes,
I think this is a really, I didn't know this story, Thank you. I think this is an excellent example of how COVID is raising awareness of transnational families, and because it's affecting more people on greater scale, I think it's raising the issue more clearly as well. And a comparable case is the Australian case I referred to of, they were actually British grandparents. They were young, old, young 60s, in their 60s, British grandparents who got this letter from Home Affairs and actually left the country at great expense, risking infection because of their commitment to their informal care duties back in Australia. So yes, that became a big issue in the media, and Home Affairs actually said it was an error, and it was their policy. So we hope to see policy changes flow off from this as a result. Yeah. Kelly, you're on mute. Yeah.
Thanks, Loretta. And another comment from Veronica Clark-Novak. So she says, she loves the fact how you incorporated polymedia communication with proximate kin. They also have these options open for consideration and also can prefer online over in-person contact. On the other hand, she doesn't agree about greater control in remote communication. Try not to answer a phone call from your grandmother. And once the call is mistimed, it's more difficult to control one's emotions and sound happy, not irritated, than during a ritual prearranged visit.
And I would argue, I love that comment, thank you. And I would argue that that makes it more like proximate care. You can't hide your emotional state when you're standing in front of the person. So I think this is an example of how we do have co-presence in polymedia contexts that approximate physical co-presence in some dimensions, and that one in particular. I want to ask people if they found my argument about digital kinning and digital homing convincing, but probably it's not easy, is it? Probably people need to go and read our papers and comment. But I'm really struggling with this notion of capturing older people's desire for dignity in care that is somehow entwined with a social relational notion of self. And I don't know how good a job I'm doing of expressing that, but I really welcome feedback. Please email me, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas.
Well, thanks, Loretta. I'll just give people a moment because we're about 10 seconds behind from the live to what people are seeing in the stage. If you've got any final questions or comments for Loretta, can you please speak now? In the meantime, I'll just let you know that we've got another live event at 3 p.m. BST. That's from our Canadian collaborators about work in care standards. So please join us for that if you can. You can also check out our expo area. So we've got a few posters from some of our colleagues as well. So please do take a look at all the posters that we've got as well and interact with the poster authors. I can't see anything else coming through in the stage chat. So I'll thank you, Loretta. Thank you so much for joining us in such an interesting talk and for taking the time as well to stay with us beyond our allocation. And thank you for everybody for your questions as well. So thank you, and I'll say goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.